For the famous battle portion of the video, we'll be journeying into the dark future of the end times, when Queek launched his final all-out assault against Skarsnik, in a climactic battle for Karak 8 Peaks, known as the War in the Great Vale. When Queek unleashed his claw packs upon the Great Vale, he expected to face a horrid series of ambushes the instant his troops emerged from the depths of the mountain. Instead, over 100,000 Skaven marched out timidly into the murky sunlight, to find nothing awaiting them. Even the squalid town of the Green Things was empty, only a colossal orc statue standing against the verminous hordes. The Headtaker watched with no small amount of irritation as the Ratmen swarmed across the Vale looking for enemies, and yet finding nothing. All of his warlords, Clan Eshin assassins, and even the backstabbing Grayseer could find no sign of Skarsnik. The other leaders of the Claw Packs began to celebrate, before Queek rounded on them with barely restrained wrath. The little imp would never leave the City of Pillars willingly. The warlord of Clan Moors ordered for his armies to carry on as planned, and tear all the Green Things' structures down and burn them to ash. As rat ogres and warp fire throwers began to work, Queek could only glare from the rubble that was once Karagnar. Sooner or later, the little imp would appear. After nearly an hour of work, the idiot fools of Clan Skryre proved incapable of destroying the massive idol standing at the center of the ruined Green Thing city. Yet just as Queek considered going down to remove their useless heads, his ears perked up at a bizarre squealing noise coming from above. Glancing upwards at the open sky, the Headtaker and his generals watched with fascination as Goblin Doomdiver soared through the air before crashing into the Skaven infantry below to devastating effect. Moments later, the stone colossus let out a rumbling roar and began crushing the troops cluttered around it. Suddenly, the Grimgate thundered open, and an endless tide of greenskins came pouring out directly into the center of the city. Queek eagerly raised Dwarf Gouger and shrieked for loyal Ska to signal the charge. The 5th Claw Pack surged down the rubble of Karagnar towards the main Green Thing force in an unstoppable tide of ragged fur. As he rushed towards the rapidly expanding Night Goblin line, the Headtaker managed to quickly survey the battlefield to see more Green Thing's infantry pouring in from all sides. He still couldn't see Skarsnik, but the Imp Thing tended to hide in the center of his largest force, so that's where the Headtaker would go. Predictably, as the Skaven slaves charged within a few yards, the cackling goblin shoved out drugged Green Things whirling around massive balls of iron. The warlord carefully waited out of reach for his vanguard to be utterly obliterated, as the fanatics spent their fury, making the slaves much more useful than they ever were in life, now in death. Then he charged in personally, at the head of his Red Guard. With the slaves out of the way, the Lord of Clan Moors plowed into the Night Goblins with hundreds of elite storm vermin right behind him. The Rat King of Karak 8 Peaks was a whirlwind of death among the Crooked Moon troops. butchering a handful each second as he continued towards the dead center of the Greenskin army. After the Red Guard easily tore through 2 full regiments of Night Goblins, their progress ground to an abrupt halt as they tumbled into a readied contingent of heavily armored Black Orcs. The 2 elite units smashed into one another as the Black Orc warboss cut his way towards the Headtaker. With his Storm Vermin bodyguard fighting madly around him, Queek's anger boiled at the audacity of the big meat, and he rushed forward to meet it. Such was the Orc's size and strength that it effortlessly charged over 2 Redguard without even bothering to swing its massive axe, spilling them onto the ground and crushing their bodies beneath its tread. Mighty as it was, however, this big meat paled in comparison to another Queek had once dueled in Black Crag. Just before the 2 warlords collided, the Headtaker gracefully spun at the last second to avoid his foe's blade, and brought Dwarf Gouger's spike hurtling into the Black Orc's chest. The warboss made a surprised gurgle as even its thick plate armor proved no match before Queek leapt up and stabbed his serrated blade through its visor, killing his foe instantly. The big meat collapsed, and Queek wasted no time in ripping off its helmet and sawing off the tusked head. He handed it to one of his Storm Vermin, who jammed it onto a free spike on the warlord's trophy rack, which had been left open for today's festivities. The Black Orcs were quickly surrounded, and managed to remain defiant, until Queek shrieked at Ska to break them, and his loyal lieutenant tore apart the standard bearer. Finally, the Greenskins broke and fled, leaving the path to the Grimgate open, where Queek knew Skarsnik must be hiding. Just as he gave the order to pursue, however, a horn rang out across the valley, and goblin screams filled the air. The Headtaker looked up in time to see goblin doom divers plummet down to crash among his forces, shaking their morale and slowing their charge. Irritated, the warlord of Clan Moors deftly climbed atop a ruined wall and took in the battlefield. He hissed at what he saw. Goblins were pouring out of the mountains to the west, encircling his rear. The huge idol they had discovered that morning was smashing through the Skaven center, some shaman atop its shoulder hurling bolts of green energy. Queek wished he had some screaming bell or hell pit abominations to counter this, but alas, the cursed beard things had killed his only ones. Squealing turned his attention towards the caves that his Clan Eshin scouts had assured him were clear, only to see a stream of bounding squigs led by a red one the size of a giant. At the foot of Karag Zilfin, Mangler squigs came spinning into unaware ratmen to unleash terrible violence. As if that all wasn't enough, the Skaven war machines went eerily silent on the eastern edge of the valley. Although Skaven vision isn't great for long distance, Queek could just make out what appeared to be a horrific swarm of wolf rat-sized spiders interspersed with a few truly massive ones. The warlord bared his teeth in anger. The green imp had ambushed him again! Yet the core of his army still held, as it appeared the force coming from the Grimgate had no intention of returning to the fight, and those around the banner of Clan Moors knew better than to start fleeing. Thinking fast, the warlord started to shout new orders when he was rudely interrupted by a terrifying shriek overhead. A large shadow blotted out the sun, as the only warning before a brutish wyvern with a huge orc upon its back landed amidst the clan rats just behind Queek. Most of the Skaven center panicked and began to flee, much to the warlord's chagrin. He swiftly gave out orders to the messengers cowering beside him. The Greyseer Conscript would handle the idol and its sorcerer. The Gromril armored iron-skinned storm vermin were to go with the Clan Mulder contingent to secure the Grimgate and catch the fleeing green things, while he would deal with the Wyvern personally. Queek couldn't see Gobla or Skarsnik anywhere, so he'd have to settle for the Orc Warboss in the meantime. Plus, he had never killed a Wyvern before. The Warlord of Clan Moors swiftly closed the gap between him and the Wyvern, as it messily devoured any Skaven who wandered too close. The beast's gut bulged with corpses, but it had the simple solution of defecating while fighting to clear constant space. Atop its back, the orc lashed out with a wicked spear, impaling squealing clan rats that it would wave in front of the Wyvern's face like a tied carrot. Ordering his Redguard to stay back, the Headtaker marched out alone in front of the pair and slammed his weapons together to draw their attention. Announcing himself as the mighty Queek in the orc's crude language, the Warboss turned his mount to face the Skaven, and the duel was set. The Headtaker knew the stupid meat Warboss would flee if his storm vermin had joined, so he strode forward cautiously and readied himself. He didn't have to wait long, as the Wyvern let loose a savage roar and plowed forwards. The orc thrust his spear at Queek, but he easily parried it aside and brought his sword slashing down on the mount's skull. Much to his surprise, the blade simply bounced off the creature's iron-hard scales, before its jaws came snapping at him, with another spear thrust from the rider. The Warlord of Carrick Eight Peaks narrowly avoided them both by leaping back, only to have to roll aside immediately as the Wyvern's venomous stinger tail plunged into the earth where he had been standing. Wiping off some of the sizzling black venom from his cheek, the mighty Queek stood with a snarl as the orc began to laugh. The lizard beast continued to chase after the Headtaker, its jagged fangs missing him by inches as he tripped over some collapsed masonry. In this moment of vulnerability, the orc stabbed forward and cut a deep gash across Queek's arm. Hissing with pain, he managed to jump back just as the Warboss started to ramble on about itself. The Headtaker barely listened as the green thing monologued about being the best from the Broken Tooth tribe, and instead waited patiently for an opening. The talkative ones always ended up making some critical mistake. He and the Wyvern circled each other while the orc continued to ramble, the Ratman's eyes carefully focusing for any exploit. Finally, the Warboss roared out that he was Krolg Crushhelm, and he would be the real boss of Carrick Eight Peaks before spurring his mount forwards. The Wyvern roared and committed fully to the final attack, its scorpion tail swiping down, jaws coming from the left, and Krog's spear from the right. That is when Queek saw the opening. He exploded into motion, ducking the dripping stinger and batting aside the orc's spear in the same motion. He then collapsed his knees to roll just under the Wyvern's jaws before springing to his feet and spinning around to bring the spike of Dwarf Gouger precisely into the lizard's soft eyeball. The monster screeched in agony and reeled backwards, but the Headtaker held on to his prized weapon and was dragged high into the air. At the absolute perfect moment, he released his hold on the haft and soared above, twisting around to bring his sawtooth sword arcing down. Krog's head snapped up in surprise to follow the Warlord's descent, before toppling off his shoulders into the dirt. Queek landed on his feet in a crouch with a gleeful smile upon his lips. That had been a good fight. He did decide to wait until the Wyvern's death throes were completely over, before retrieving Dwarf Gouger, however. Taking stock of the battlefield, Queek was pleased to see that everything was under control. The idol had been toppled over and scattered across the corpse-strewn earth. One of the terrifying vermin lords was dispatching the spider hordes, and the large, colossal squigs seemed to be rampaging off into some unnotable part of the battlefield. The rest of the goblins were being routed by the superior Skaven forces, now that their reserves were pouring out from the burnt cliffs. Although Scarstick was still nowhere to be seen, the Headtaker knew that none could contest the City of Pillars now. Soon, it would be Belegar's turn. Truly, Queek Headtaker was the great mightiest warlord of Carrick Eight Peaks.